Hi, I'm Jason Tetlow, the founder of the law firm Tetlow Law PC. Welcome to the Steel City and Conemaugh Valley Law Advocate podcast. I've been helping clients with personal injury and medical malpractice claims since 2001. I created this podcast to provide an overview of the personal injury and medical malpractice processes and answer the questions I most often get when I first meet with prospective clients. My goal is to fight for my clients so they are fairly compensated when they are the victims of negligent actions or malpractice. If you need representation or just have questions, don't hesitate to contact me at 412-248-9600 or visit our firm website at www.tetlowlaw.com. That's TETLOWLAW.com. Any information provided in this podcast should not be taken or relied upon as legal advice. You should always consult with an attorney about the particular facts and issues of your case.
Welcome to the Steel City and Conemaugh Valley Law Advocate, a podcast dedicated to bringing you legal insights on personal injury and medical malpractice law. Brought to you by Tetlow Law PC and featuring the expertise of Jason Tetlow. Let's get this episode started.
All right, welcome everyone to the Steel City and Conemaugh Valley Law Advocate, your trusted legal voice for plaintiffs' personal injury and medical malpractice law in Western Pennsylvania. We're here today with Jason Tetlow, owner of Tetlow Law, and we're excited to bring this season of podcast episodes to the listeners out there to talk about personal injury, medical malpractice law, the things that go into that. Jason's been practicing in this area for quite some time now in Western Pennsylvania, and we wanted to use this first episode as a chance to get our listeners to get a chance to meet Jason and understand a little bit more about who he is and the attorney that he has become. So, Jason, welcome to this first episode of Steel City and Conemaugh Valley Law Advocate.
Great. I'm happy to be here.
So, Jason, you and I have known each other for a while. We actually went to law school together. So I've seen you grow up, if you will, in your legal career from the beginning. And I will preface this whole episode with one of the things I know about Jason Tetlow is he's a humble man and he doesn't like to talk about himself. And this first episode is about you introducing yourself to people. And I know that is not your natural state to tell people who you are, what you do, brag about yourself. And I'm going to force everything I can to get that out of you in this episode, because I think it's important, particularly in the practices that you typically engage in, personal injury and medical malpractice, that we'll talk about further in more episodes, that people understand who it is that's going to be fighting for them. I'm sure you get this often, that when people are coming to you the first time, when they've had an accident or a medical malpractice claim, that they're at a tough spot in their life, whether it's for themselves or a loved one, and they need to know that they're comfortable with the person that's representing them, just like they would be trying to represent themselves. So I think it is important for people to get a chance to know you. So we'll start that off with, Jason, why don't you tell us a little bit about where you grew up, where your roots come from, and how we'll kind of walk through how you got into the practice of law.
Well, first of all, Pete, thank you for the very kind introduction. I grew up in the South Hills of Pittsburgh in Mount Lebanon. I always was an active person, and I continue to be. My father was a high school teacher, and one thing that we always valued in our house was education. And, if at school you were running into problems, then that was going to create bigger problems at home for you. So while I always remained active and was involved with various sports, what was the number one priority in our house was that, you get your schoolwork done, or else it was going to be a problem. So it was a nice, I feel very fortunate now as you get a little bit older, looking back at, your upbringing. And, I feel very fortunate to have great parents and siblings. I'm one of 5 kids, and I have 2 older sisters, an older brother, a younger brother. Currently, some of them are scattered throughout the country, and a couple siblings are still here locally. But it was always a nice environment to grow up in. Definitely a lot of battles with siblings, which makes you learn about yourself and makes you learn about others.
Yeah.
So Yeah.
Well, and you said your dad was a teacher. What did he teach?
So my dad was a history teacher at Keystone Oaks High School, and he taught there for many years. And although while I enjoy some parts of history, I never caught that, I would say history bug. I know enough about history to be dangerous. But yeah, he was a teacher, 30 some years, took an early retirement and, has enjoyed his retirement years and now spends the winters down in Florida, which I don't blame them to get out of these Pittsburgh winters. So,
especially sitting here in early March of 2025, we just came through a winter that would make you want to move to Florida.
Yeah, and there was snow on the ground today.
Yeah, I saw that. This is the tough time of year in Western PA, as we all know, that you don't know what you're going to get day to day, and you get a glimpse of sunshine one day, and it just disappears on you the next.
That's right.
So you grew up in Mount Lebanon, relatively large family. You're kind of in the middle. Your father's a teacher. They live in Mount Lebanon, and I'm correct that you've moved back to Mount Lebanon. That's where you've raised your own family. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So I went away to college to Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, and was there for 4 years. Many of my roommates were there longer for various reasons, but I was on the 4-year plan. And after college, I actually moved to Chicago, lived in Chicago for a couple years. I was working for a large health insurance company, working on a sales team and was on a sales track, and really enjoyed my time in Chicago. And it was a fun time because it was the time where Michael Jordan was still playing for the Bulls and they were on championship runs. And it was just, it's a great sports town, and I'm kind of a sports junkie. So it was really enjoyable. But I realized working for a large insurance company was not going to be for me. So I decided to then take the LSATs and go to law school. And the logical choice for me was to come back here to Pittsburgh and go to law school. And it would have been kind of challenging to do that living in Chicago, financially and other things. So it was nice to come back. It was nice to come back here and attend Duquesne University.
So obviously at some point you got it in your brain that, hey, I'm going to go to law school. Was this something that had been percolating earlier, or was it at that point in life where you're like, I got to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life? Was there any real driving factor towards that, or was it something you just thought this, I think, could be interesting for me?
I think it was a little bit of both. I think I always had it in the back of my mind that, what would be a profession that would challenge me, really. Once you get over that fear factor of, oh, I don't know if I can do this or not, and then you just put your mind to it and you do what it takes to prepare and, study for the LSATs, get the applications in for schools. And so it was always in the back of my mind. But I mean, I didn't grow up saying I want to be a lawyer. That wasn't, what I wanted to do since I was a kid. And going to Indiana, I got a management degree, and which is very broad. And even after school, after college, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. And so it got to the point where I realized, hey, I need to really get focused here. And, law school then became more of the priority and became more top of mind. And, certainly now looking back, I'm glad I had all those experiences. It was 2 years in between college and when I started law school. So I had that couple years to work, live in a different city, figure things out. Sometimes that's what it takes in life. Things aren't going to always be easy. And, so it was nice to have that sort of middle period between college and law school to enjoy a different city, different experiences. Yeah, that's how that all came about.
And sort of, because we went through the same experience together. We went to night school together at Duquesne, which is located in Pittsburgh. And night school is a 4-year program, then a 3-year program like you would if you were doing full-time. So 8 years of schooling is a lot. I think, I kind of did the same thing where I took a little bit of a break between college and law school. And that, I think, helped me as well. It clears your head, makes you ready to do the next thing, because I found, at least for myself, and I don't know if your experience was the same, that you get in that school mode and you kind of, you need that little break to get back to reality, to say, all right, I'm ready to do this next thing seriously, rather than just rolling through with schooling 8 years in a row. That was my experience. I don't know if you felt the same thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think coming out of college that that I was ready for law school. I think it took the couple
Right.
years to kind of recharge the battery from an academic standpoint. As you know, it was, there were some semesters that were really a grind. You know, you
Yeah.
you
Right.
you're not getting home till, whatever time it is at night, and then start it all over again the next day. But looking back, the experiences were great, and that's, you learn from all that. And one thing that I've learned is that I really don't want to go have to sit back into a classroom and,
Right.
and
Right.
take exams and go through all of that again. But it was certainly an experience where, again, you learn a lot, and you learn a lot about yourself, and you learn a lot about discipline. You still want to enjoy things in life and have fun, but you learn how to really buckle down and get your work done.
Well, and my experience in the night school, and I think, you're exemplary of this, is that, most people were working during the day, then taking classes at night. And then you're done with classes. You have preparation for classes the next day. So you have a lot of reading to do. I wouldn't say it was an enjoyable experience or relaxing experience. Maybe enjoyable from the sense that you were learning something. There was a camaraderie of that, was all that. But I think it also was probably a good preparation for, hey, this is the type of attention that you are going to have to put into your cases, and the attention that you're going to have to put in chunks of time to get something right for a client. Did you feel that that night school experience has translated into some good work discipline for you in your current cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. And really what helped me was I worked primarily at one law firm when we were in law school. It was a small plaintiffs firm here in the city, and they did the same work that I'm doing now. I mean, they did personal injury work, people involved in motor vehicle accidents. They did a lot of medical malpractice work. So I was very fortunate in that I was able to sit in depositions. I was able to sit in trials. And while I couldn't participate in front of the judge and in front of the jury because I wasn't a lawyer at the time, I was doing a lot of the behind the scenes activity that's involved in a trial, writing motions, preparing witnesses, doing certain jury research, when you get the prospective jury list. There was one year in particular, it was a lot of long work hours. And I hate to admit this, but it's true. It was a lot of skipped classes because I was working a lot.
Right, right,
um, and there was some late hours, but I was very fortunate because through those experiences, I was really able to, when we got out of law school, and fortunately for us, we got through the bar exam successfully. I was able to really hit the ground running,
right,
and I felt very, I don't want to use the word comfortable, but I felt prepared that,
right.
when you go into a deposition, in our business, some depositions, you go in, if it's a, more of a basic auto accident type case, it may not be a terribly involved deposition, but, when you're deposing a neurosurgeon or an anesthesiologist or an orthopedic spine surgeon, those are very involved. And so I was fortunate in that I was able to learn a lot at the firm that I worked in when we were in school, and just to understand the process really and understand the preparation, what it took to get ready for cases and how to work up cases really.
Well, and I know the firm you were involved with, and they were a renowned group of attorneys that were recognized in this community and really had been doing this a long time. So to be able to see how people who had been doing this for a long time, a successful track record, are doing these things, I would imagine was very valuable for you to have a much bigger head start than somebody, going 3 years of school straight through and nothing else, and then just being asked to start practicing law the next day.
Yeah, definitely, without a doubt. I mean, having those hands-on experiences was really key. And like you alluded to, I mean, it was a very reputable firm. These are very good lawyers. Some are retired now, and I'm fortunate. There's one lawyer that still works, and his office is close to mine, so we still collaborate on cases, and I'm always bouncing ideas off of him, and so it's very nice. But those experiences, during law school, really helped me and continue to help me to this day. And it was a good, it was a good way for me to, like mentioned earlier, to really hit the ground running once I became a lawyer and started handling my own cases.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but they primarily did medical malpractice cases. Is that correct?
They did. Yeah. I mean, that was their focus. I mean, their focus was medical malpractice cases. And, there were a lot more jury trials that were happening 20 plus years ago than there are now. That's just the reality of, what's happened today, and with the alternative dispute resolution options that are available, mediation and arbitration and other things, they weren't as prevalent 20 plus years ago. So there was a lot more jury trials. So that was really beneficial, to be able to sit right there next to the lead lawyer on the case and help him pick a jury, and then preparing witnesses. And that was really invaluable experience. That is hard to get these days for a younger lawyer. There's not as many jury trials that are happening these days. They're happening, but just not the numbers they were 20 years ago.
Yeah. And I think looking back on it from at least my perspective, that medical malpractice attorneys, that's some of the hardest plaintiffs practice to do. There's a lot of medicine, there's science behind it. You almost have to become an expert on those subjects every time that you pick one of those cases up. So having an understanding of medical backgrounds and the way health systems work and the way, medical teams work together, that's an important piece that you don't learn that in law school. That's something you're only going to learn by doing it. And then to your point, I think getting in the courtroom is something that is less and less often available to new attorneys. And so you can be as prepared as possible and understand the details of your case, but there's an element of going into an alien environment that you're uncomfortable with and you're not familiar with that is going to throw you off your game until you've done it enough times. And I would think those two combination things really help prepare you to sort of jump right out of the gates and be running immediately in your own practice.
And you bring up a good point. I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but I think it's a smaller percentage of lawyers in Pennsylvania that do practice in the medical negligence field, because they're very detail oriented cases. I mean, you don't just jump into a medical malpractice case unless you've done your due diligence, and you have to do a good job of analyzing a case, working with your experts, working with nurse legal consultants, or whomever it is that you use in order to vet the cases and determine whether or not it's a case you want to get involved in or not. It's a lot that goes into it. And the other thing is that, the lawyers in these cases, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later or in another series, is, we work on these cases on a contingency fee, meaning that our fee is based upon the success of the case. We don't charge by the hour. I always tell my clients initially, you're never going to get a bill from me that says I worked 10 hours at $300 or $400 an hour and here's my bill. My clients don't get that,
Right.
So, that's all the more reason for us to really do a good job at the initial phases of getting the medical records, analyzing the records. I personally work with a couple of nurse legal consultants. They're not on staff here, but they may as well be. They work as independent contractors, and I have a very close relationship with them. And they do an excellent job of getting through large medical charts, focusing on the issues, and really determining whether or not it's a case that we're going to pursue further or not. But it takes all that legwork before you even get to filing an action or filing a lawsuit in court.
Right. And we are going to have some specific episodes that are going to talk, hey, this is what goes into a medical malpractice claim or a personal injury claim, what has to be proven, what you have to do on the back end to make it work, and the kind of experts that have to be involved in expenses and things like that. Because to your point, you are running a business, so you have to choose your cases wisely to say that you're choosing ones you think have a chance of succeeding, because there's a lot of expense, time, and things that go into this. But another element to this, and I think this is something that you excel at, from my view of how you've interacted with people, is that you also have to shoot people straight. and tell them, do I think you have a real shot at succeeding here? Because I've seen this myself. I'm sure you've seen it the same way. Going through a lawsuit or going through the process of settling a case, whatever, it's emotionally taxing. It's on your brain, especially if it's, the consequence of a major crisis that has caused you physical ailments or loss of earnings or a lot of different things that can come from these, that you have people that are in a moment of crisis. And the last thing you want to do is send them down a path to be like, you have no chance of succeeding here.
Well, that's you bring up a good point where, when I meet with people initially and somebody has, gone through a lot or they've suffered, a major injury or they've lost a loved one, sometimes the hardest thing to do in our business is to tell people you can't help them,
Right.
But, you have to be, in my experience and how I like to handle my cases and interact with my clients, is I try to be as upfront as possible because that's the only way to go. You cannot initially getting involved with a case, you cannot give clients the false hope that, hey, you've got the greatest case in the world. And then all of a sudden you go to a jury trial and you lose and your clients are looking at you like, how did that happen?
Right.
Because the reality is these, medical malpractice type cases, they're not straightforward and they're not easy. And any lawyer that tells you they are easy, I think is just trying to fool you. So you do have to be very upfront with clients initially. I think most lawyers that handle these kinds of cases do that. And, if they don't do that, I think they're, running a risk of, getting egg in their face down the road because, that's the difficulty is there's no guarantees in this business. And while, the lawyer might think, or the client might think, hey, I've got this great case and we're going to do this. And, it's going to settle for all this money or what have you. The reality is there's a lot that goes into it. And, while there might be some cases that work out great and we can get our clients fair or good compensation for what they've gone through, great. I mean, that's the goal. But you have to be very upfront with people initially because the reality is I can meet with, I'm just throwing this out there as a hype, but I can meet with 100 people or I could speak on the phone with 100 people. And of those 100 people, maybe we get records and do an analysis in 10 of those situations. And maybe of the 10 of those situations, only 4 or 5 become a case. And that's the reality of the nuances and the difficulty and everything that goes into a medical malpractice type case.
I think it's fair to say, and again, we'll get into the details that allow you to determine whether a case has a chance of success or not. And there are no guarantees, certainly, but I would imagine you often see people and injuries alone or bad outcomes alone isn't the sole factor that determines, from your experience, your professional experience, whether someone's going to be successful or not.
This is where sometimes I struggle personally is, it's hard whenever you meet with someone who's lost a loved one or they have a serious, injury and they've been through a lot and you tell them, hey, I can't help you for,
right.
Whatever the reason may be. And, that's the difficulty many times of the kind of law that we practice because, I like to think that I'm a compassionate person and I feel for people that have been through a lot or they've lost a loved one.
Right.
But the reality is we have to go through a process on our end in a medical malpractice case to determine whether it is a case. And that includes hiring the experts, which is, and again, this may be something that we might cover in a different series, but, in a medical malpractice type case, there is a requirement in Pennsylvania that you have an expert. You have to have an expert. So we have to go through that analysis and hire the expert, have the experts tell us where there was negligence, or maybe many times I could send records to an expert and the expert tells me, hey, it's not a case for these reasons. But
right.
That's all the process that you have to go through to, determine whether or not the case has merit and you're going to proceed.
Well, and I think going back to a point earlier that you have a monetary and a time investment into a case to get it to a chance of having any kind of successful resolution, but your client is going to have an emotional and a time element themselves. And so if you look at it as a simple investment from both sides of that equation, they're putting in something as well. So the last thing you want to do is to tell them, let's go down this road together without thinking there's a chance of succeeding. And they're putting all this into it. They're just going to be very disappointed at the end if it never had a chance of succeeding.
Right. Yeah. And it's tough because some clients, you have to relive the experience, or you have
Right.
to, relive and discuss the loss of a loved one. And it is taxing on clients, and that can be very, emotionally and mentally draining for them. That's why as lawyers, you hear the word counselor at law, right? Or we're also a counselor.
Right.
And that is true because, we do spend time with our clients and we help them through the process, because, when you sit down for a deposition and you have another lawyer asking you questions for 4 or 5 hours at a time, that's taxing,
Right.
and that can be tough on clients. So we have to counsel them through that process, meet with clients ahead of time for an extended period of time, have them feel comfortable. It's hard for many people, which is understandable, to, relive a bad experience.
Right.
But that's what you have to do in these cases. And that, so you want to make sure initially from the outset of the case that I'm on the same page with my clients. And that's, I just met with a client not too long ago because I realized in our phone conversation that we weren't on the same page. So I said, hey, let's get this meeting scheduled so that we're all thinking in a similar manner.
We met yesterday, and you told me something I thought that was really good that would be worth sharing with the listeners here, which is, what is your answer when somebody comes to you and says, hey, here's what happened. What's my case worth?
Yeah,
Because I'm sure you get it all the time.
So that happens often, and it's a fair question. I mean, I understand why people ask me, initially, hey, what's my case worth? And like we talked about yesterday, Pete, my answer is always the same. Prospective clients, and then usually they become a client, always look at me a little bit strange when I answer the question, because my answer is, if I do give you an answer, don't hire me.
Right.
Because at the initial stage and at the initial meeting, I don't know what the value of the case is. Usually at that point in time, we haven't looked at the medical records, which is a requirement in these cases. We have to get all of the pertinent medical records, evaluate them, analyze them. I don't know many times at the initial phase if the client is going to be able to return to work or not. So we don't know the full value of loss of income damages that could be applicable in a case. We don't know if that person is going to require future medical treatment, future surgeries. There's a lot of unknowns when it comes to what's the value of the case at the initial meeting. So
Right.
when I tell people that don't hire me, sometimes they're like, well, what are you talking about? They think I'm a little bit nutty, which maybe I am, but but it's the truth. I don't know at the initial phase. I don't know early on what the value of somebody's case is. So,
And there's too many factors that go into this that you can't put it in a calculator.
and there's too many unknowns at the early phase.
Right.
And when folks ask me that, again, it's a fair question. It's not an unfair question. I understand why they're asking, but the reality is we just don't know early on. We don't, and sometimes we don't even know if it is a case, at the initial meeting. So
Right.
again, I understand the question, and it's certainly a fair question.
But I think it illustrates that, honesty is important, and setting expectations is important, and recognizing that there is a investment from the client as well into this process that has to be thought about to make sure that everybody's making the proper decisions at the beginning.
100%. I mean, the client has to be. Listen, the client has to be comfortable with me. I mean, that's a big element. And what happens in today's day and age is there's lawyers all over the place. We see it on TV, we see it, on billboards, and lawyers are very accessible now. So people will go and they'll call one law firm, and then, if somebody doesn't call them back, shortly, they'll go on and move on to the next firm. But my thought process and the way I've handled cases is from the beginning, the client has to be comfortable. They have to be comfortable with me,
Right.
and I have to be comfortable with them. There's been certain circumstances where I may not want to get involved in a case, or I may not represent somebody because I realize that we may never be on the same page with certain aspects, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's definitely an investment of time on the client's part. And,
Right.
the client has to know what's going to go into a case, what's going to be required of them. And, and I think that's a good thing.
I would imagine most of these cases typically take a longer time to resolve. You can get into years, and you're going to have a relationship both ways with these people for a long period of time. So, does that factor into your decision making, and in your counseling of people to say, we're in this together for a long time. We have to make sure this is a good fit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's especially a lot of the medical malpractice type cases. Once you file a lawsuit, I mean, it could take easily 2 years from the time you get a trial date. So, there's a lot that happens in that 2-year period. And there's a lot of communication with the client, and you have to keep them up to date, and they have to keep you up to date as to what's going on with their treatment or what have you. There's a lot that goes into it. But fortunately for me, Pete, and the way I have my practice structured right now is I'm not a volume shop. I don't handle a high volume of cases. That's by design. That's my choice. I've never wanted to be like a huge firm and have tons of lawyers. I mean, I currently right now, which is nice, I have one associate and I have a paralegal, and we have a nice small group. I usually have law clerks that I hire. What's nice about that is, we have a caseload here that I believe is manageable. I mean, sometimes we get crazy and we get behind, and
Sure.
that happens. But we have a manageable caseload, and therefore, like I tell clients, and clients know this, when they call the firm, they're speaking with a lawyer. They're not necessarily just speaking with a secretary or a paralegal, and there's nothing wrong with that. But they are going to get the interaction with the lawyer and spend time with the lawyer, whether it be in person, whether it be over the phone, or whether it be by Zoom, having Zoom meetings. That's how I have my firm structured, and that's the way I like it, and that's the way I really want to continue to be.
So here we are in 2025. So we're about 24 years out from you passing the bar exam and pushing on 30 years of law firm experience, if you consider the 4 years that you were working during law school. So with that benefit of hindsight, can you give us an idea of what do you think are some necessary traits that make a good lawyer doing the types of work that you do?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a good question. You might be able to answer that question better than I can because you've been around a lot of lawyers. But I think first and foremost is you have to have compassion. You have to really have the ability to understand your clients and what they're going through. Because when you have that compassion, in my opinion, that then leads to the motivation from the lawyer standpoint, because you see what your clients are going through, and you want to help them. These cases, these civil cases that we work on, what the law says that the person can get from their harm is money. And, those are the damages. And, that's ultimately our objective as a lawyer, that handles personal injury, medical malpractice cases. But that's not what we're thinking about all the time. That's at the end. That's kind of the end game when you're negotiating a case. But really, initially, the lawyer has to have compassion. They have to have patience. They have to have understanding. And, you also have to have the motivation and the drive to work hard, because that's what it takes in these cases.
Well, and I would think that you have to have a drive towards justice. And the way our system is set up, justice is defined in a monetary amount at the end. And that is what it is. There is no revenge. There is no, it's generally driven by dollars. And maybe for some people at the end of the day, that's unsatisfactory, or it doesn't make things right, but it's what we have. And do you feel that drive for justice is something that helps, is also important in somebody in your type of practice areas?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's, like we had just talked about, the remedy and what clients can get is compensation for what they've been through. And that's the ultimate justice in a civil type of case. And when you go through the process and you're taking depositions and you're working with experts and getting your proper experts lined up, all of that is toward an end game, which is getting closer to the time of trial and ultimately trying the case in front of a jury if a case gets to that point. The alternative to that is many times cases will go to a mediation or they'll go to an arbitration, but those are all forms of justice. I mean, that justice in our profession comes in all those different forms. And more, these cases end up resolving at a mediation. You pick a mediator and the mediator kind of, I like to say, just goes back and forth between rooms and tries to come to a resolution on the case where, typically speaking, neither side is terribly happy. Maybe
Right.
the defense pays a little more than they wanted to, or the plaintiffs maybe settle for a little bit less than they thought they may get. But that's usually the sign of a good settlement. But those are, in 2025, Pete, those are all forms of justice in personal injury, medical malpractice type cases. Not all cases that are filed in court go in front of a jury trial. Certainly they do, but the reality is, in today's day and age, the vast majority of cases are resolved, outside of a jury trial. So the justice in these types of cases in 2025 takes on a lot of different forms.
Can you share some experiences of how you have positively impacted somebody's life through your profession, and how has that been fulfilling for you personally?
It's a good question. It's a broad question, but it's a good question. It's always great for me, whenever you've worked on a case for a period of time and the case gets resolved favorably and the most satisfying thing for me is that the client is happy. And again, the money factor is just what we can get clients. That's what Pennsylvania law in most states in the United States is. In a civil case, it's getting them compensation for what they've been through. So what's most satisfying, what's most gratifying is after a case, and you see that the client is really thankful, but more so that the compensation that they receive is going to help them. And I've had clients over the years, like all lawyers that handle these cases, and I've been doing it now for many years, the compensation sometimes is smaller and sometimes it's big. And it depends upon, the specifics of the case. But many times it doesn't matter the size of the case. When the client receives, fair justice, fair compensation for what they've been through, and that's going to help them and assist them in the future for whatever it is that they need. Sometimes clients need future medical care. Just to give you an example, I had a client, this is 2 or 3 years ago, a client that suffered a very severe spinal cord injury during a spinal surgery. And he unfortunately became, paraplegic as a result of the incident. And whenever we were able to get the case resolved, and that case went on for a couple of years, year and a half, 2 years. Whenever we were able to get the case resolved and, successfully for the client, it was very gratifying because the first thing that the client did was to buy a handicap accessible van, and it was all decked out. And I remember speaking with the client's wife. Well, she was my client also, but she was a little bit worried about the cost and should I buy it? And my advice to her was, well, that's why the compensation that you received is there. So go buy it. Go do what you can to make your life a little bit easier, a little bit less painful for everything that he's gone through. That to me is what the gratifying part is that, ultimately, and I know this may sound cheesy, but ultimately, if the client is helped by the compensation that they receive, then I feel like I've done my job.
When I imagine you see a lot of people that in that example, you can't give this guy his legs back. He would, I'm sure, prefer that over any monetary compensation, but that's what you can do for him. And as much as it is that you've set it up to be like, look, I'm going to make some things easier in your life moving forward through this, I would imagine it's also a sense of closure of this chapter and the ability to focus on what's in the future. That for a lot of people, I think that's important. And maybe it's you're representing a minor, and somebody, a kid that, there was a bad birth injury type of thing. And, this kid's going to have to be taken care of for a long period of time. It's just the ability to be like, one concern's out of the way, we can move forward.
Yeah, that's 100% true. I mean, that's, the financial worry is real. And especially whenever you have a client who's been through a lot and they don't have the ability to walk, they don't have the ability to feed themselves, they don't have the ability to go to the bathroom on their own, and they need, they need home nursing care. And there's all kinds of insurance restraints on what kind of care they can get, and they're limited with the amount of care that they can get. Whenever they're able to, receive some compensation and be able to afford the care that they need, it's a great thing. That's where our system of justice works in many cases. And you have clients that they receive that compensation and then they go out and get the care that the person needs. And that's very rewarding. And that's not to say every case, Pete, is a case where somebody needs lifetime or ongoing care.
Sure.
Sometimes the compensation that folks receive is for what they've experienced in the past, right? And and that's what the law allows too. There's all different elements of damages in Pennsylvania, and one of them is past pain and suffering, past inconvenience, past embarrassment, humiliation, and what the client has experienced up to the time of trial or up to the time that you're going to a mediation or an arbitration or what have you. That's where you feel that there is justice in the law. The law is working.
And Jason, I know that you have offices currently in Pittsburgh and in Johnstown. Can you explain a little bit about the decision making of opening an office in Johnstown and how you're tied to that area and the reason why you felt it was useful to put your second office there specifically?
Yeah, so it's something that with Johnstown, it's something that just happened organically, really, over the years. So it started with one lawyer that I actually clerked with at a big law firm in Pittsburgh here when we were in law school. And he has an office in Johnstown where he currently practices with his brother. It's an office that his dad started. And, I think his dad is fully retired now, but they're great people. And it kind of just happened over the years where they would refer me personal injury, medical malpractice cases. And then other lawyers from that area would start to refer me work. So over the years, really more so over the last 10 years, I've handled a lot of cases in Cambria County. I've been to Somerset County many times, Blair County. Those areas there, I've been very fortunate to have good relationships with a lot of lawyers, in those counties. And it's nice because, I then opened up another office in Johnstown where I can meet with people, have depositions, and it's right in Johnstown. So it's very centrally located, which is great for my clients. So that's how that came about, that I've spent a lot of time out in Cambria County and Blair and Somerset counties. And I enjoy going out there. I love the people out there, very down to earth, very good people. Not there aren't anywhere else, but it's always enjoyable going out to those counties.
When we happened to find out this morning that one of the nicknames for Johnstown is the friendliest city. So that had to come from somewhere.
Right. Exactly. Very friendly people.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, you certainly cover all of Western PA or entire state, but most of your practice areas in Western PA. But I know one question to sort of follow up from that in terms of, do you see value in an attorney who has ties locally to the areas where they are picking up cases often? Is it because of familiarity with the courts, the lawyers in the area, the hospital systems? What are some things that make it valuable to have an attorney that is specifically tied to the locations where the incidents have happened?
I think all of those points that you just mentioned are helpful. And I think a familiarity with the courts is extremely helpful. In fact, not too long ago, I had a friend who was looking for a lawyer for a family member who, had a little issue with a speeding ticket,
Right.
and was worried about, the points that the family member was going to get on their license or what have you. And I don't handle those kinds of cases. So I was able to contact one of the, local lawyer out in Ebensburg, Cambria County, and he was able to represent the person in the local magistrate. And the reason I bring that up is because, he has familiarity. He knows the judge, even though, it's just a matter of a familiar
Yeah.
face, when you go into the courtroom. And I've been out to those counties enough, and Cambria County in particular, now that, I think the judge now who handles the medical malpractice work in Cambria County, I've been in front of him many times now. So, it's a familiar face. And at least I'd like to think that I have a good reputation there with him and the way I handle my cases. So that definitely, in some maybe not all circumstances, but in some circumstances, it definitely helps to be more of a local, presence in certain counties and certain venues in Pennsylvania where you're going to be practicing.
Yeah, I would agree. I would think that would certainly give you a leg up on people who may not have some of those familiarities. So, Jason, as we come to the end of episode 1, I'm going to throw a few random questions at you, and I know this is going to be your favorite part. So, if you weren't a lawyer, what would you see yourself doing right now?
Well, it's a good question, Pete. The first thing that comes to mind, but this sort of is I think my dream job was always to be like a general manager of a sports team. Really. So I think,
that's all.
Yeah. It would have been a long road, and I probably didn't think of it until a little bit later, but probably something with sports and working with a team. That really is something that I would have always wanted to do.
All right. Well, then tying to that, this leads us right into the next question. So rank your Western Pennsylvania teams in order of your fandom.
Oh boy. I would say, probably we would say, are we talking pro sports and college sports?
Whatever you gravitate towards. Yeah.
Well, the obvious answer for me is whatever my kids are playing.
Right.
But
outside of that,
but probably as far as where I would spend my time watching is the Steelers, and then Penguins. And then, even though I didn't go to Pitt, but, I'd always like to see Pitt sports do well. Unfortunately, it's been a tough basketball season for them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I probably would put the Steelers and Penguins as a close second.
You got Bobby Morris this year to give you some hope.
Very
yeah, that's
very true.
That's hopefully we can continue to be talking about them in the next month here. And our last question before we let you go: if you could go anywhere in the world tomorrow, where would it be and why? Don't say Johnstown.
Probably. No, although I do like to go to Johnstown, it wouldn't be, if I had a pick. Oh, probably I would say Ireland. I haven't been to Ireland yet. I'd like to go to Ireland. I have some Irish blood in me, so I have a good college friend that lives in Dublin. So I'd like to get over there and check out Ireland and travel around the country a little bit.
Good answer. I like it.
Thank you.
Well, Jason, thank you. That brings us to the end of episode 1. I think that was a great overview of who you are, how you help your clients, what's gotten you to the point where you are, and your background. I think all those things are important. And somebody deciding who's going to represent them in a critical point in their life. So really appreciate you taking the time for that. We'd welcome everybody to join us on episode 2. which is going to be an explanation of personal injury, generally what that means, how that comes into play. And we'll get into some more details on some things we touched base with in this first episode. But thank you, and we'll see everybody on episode 2.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Steel City and Conemaugh Valley Law Advocate, brought to you by Tetlow Law PC. If you're in need of legal representation, visit tetlowlaw.com today to connect with our team. We look forward to helping you win your case, and we'll see you on the next episode.